I'm really happy to be here. I'm always grateful to talk about this topic, the endocannabinoid system. As a way of intro, I think in many ways it's a poorly named system. The reason it was called this is because it was discovered through researchers in Israel trying to find out where does this molecule THC land in the nervous system and how does it have its effect. So it was described as the endocannabinoid system. However, I think that that name is holding it back in many ways because we so often associate it with cannabis, which is quite natural because that's that's what it's called. So, the way I think of it is a predominantly a homeostatic system. As we'll see as the presentation goes forward, it is modifiable not only by cannabis and cannabinoids, but also by a host of other interventions, including dietary, spinal manipulation actually positively influences this system, acupuncture, diet, exercise, meditation. So if we think of it as a homeostatic system as opposed to a cannabis-based system, I think that this begins to help things make a little more sense. And also, I think in this presentation, because we are going to be talking about a homeostatic system, it really is largely about maintenance and preservation of good health. A huge part of this system involves maintaining healthy stress responses. And part of the way it does this is through improving biologic communication between cells, between organs, and between body systems. There will be some technical parts to the talk, and then it's also geared towards a broad audience. So if there are technical words, just ignore them, just listen, hang in there, and I think things will begin to make sense. We're going to talk about the system first, this endocannabinoid system, this homeostatic system first, and then we'll talk about how CBD, hemp, and cannabis can affect this system. I think that in terms of a modern view of biology, we are wired for connection, not only as humans between and amongst each other, but also cellularly. And I'm going to present ideas about the ECS as almost a hardwired fiber optic network in the body that largely governs homeostasis. And just for those who may not be aware of the term homeostasis, sorry, I've been talking about it here for 3 minutes and haven't really defined it. It's the ability of an organism to maintain a balance, a dynamic equilibrium, despite a widely changing environment. So the ability of the organism to keep ourselves healthy implies the existence of these systems that are ready to maintain a quote normal state of the organism, and stability and physiologic balance are necessary so that we can survive and not be destroyed or damaged by the environment or these colossal forces of nature, including hot and cold. Biology is and does maintain its stability because it's capable of modifying itself. In animals with complex body, we have cells that live inside of the fluids that bathe our cells. Each and every cell in the body, without exception, has a component to it that is nourished by the connective tissue, which is kind of like the ocean we have brought inside of us. That's why our blood tastes like seawater. We have evolved from single organisms to multicellular organisms, brought the nutritive aspect of the ocean inside of us, and that is the fluid matrix of the body. And this fluid matrix is controlled and modified by the organism, and to a large degree by the endocannabinoid system. One of the advantages of a body, biologically speaking, is that bodies are able to be more independent from changes in the outer world by preserving our inner world despite changes in the outer environment. So think of a warm-blooded animal. We are able to maintain our body temperature despite wide fluctuations in the external environment. We're going to have Q&A at the end, as I mentioned. I'm Dr. Jake Felice. I'm a naturopathic doctor licensed in Washington and California. I've written a number of courses. They've been translated now into 4 different languages on the endocannabinoid system. You can find me at sweetwaterholistic.com. It's a small natural media company, and I will link to that at the end. I do believe that this endocannabinoid system is about health and balancing. If, as humans, we aim to maintain our health, we need to take care of our endocannabinoid system. And for me, this ECS is all about communication and connection on multiple levels. I'll have you read through the course objectives here. We had a little bit of a late start, but essentially we're going to talk about the system first. Then we're going to talk a little bit about CBD, hemp, and the plant. This is an extremely complex system, so we are really just scratching the surface today. So when we say the word cannabinoids, what in the world are cannabinoids? Cannabinoids are naturally occurring molecules. They are found in the flowers of, how are we doing, Brandon? I see you sitting there. Are things okay? Can you hear me okay?
No, yeah, you're good. I was just moving the picture
Oh, gotcha,
over.
gotcha. Wanted to make sure because I'm flying blind here with the instruments. Okay.
Yes, you're
So
good. Thank you.
what's cool about cannabinoids is they are manufactured by the cannabis plant as part of its physiologic structure. But cannabis or cannabinoids rather are also found in at least a dozen other plants. So including echinacea makes one that lands on a particular type of a cannabinoid receptor. So there are a large number of other botanical species that also produce cannabinoids. The cannabinoids work with receptors in our endocannabinoid system, which is composed not only of the receptors, but the enzymes that help regulate them. And you'll see how and why this system, endocannabinoid system, is involved in all of the other major physiologic systems. Cannabinoids can support the endocannabinoid system, helping to aid the different systems of the body to work together and promote health and homeostasis. There are an enormous number of peer-reviewed articles on cannabis. It's probably about the second most studied plant in the entire Earth's biosphere. Just from a perspective of botany and health, there have been over 25,000 articles printed in peer-reviewed medical journals on cannabis, cannabinoids, and the ECS since 1995. There's an utterly massive amount of research on the plant. We do need more human studies, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit about that later, including in the Q&A. Cannabis products were actually once a part of, in pharmacies throughout the United States. They were a part of the US pharmacopoeia. And in the early 1900s, millions and millions of prescriptions for cannabis were written each and every year. Cannabinoid receptors are located throughout the nervous system. They are involved in pain reception, and they are also the most abundant receptor system in the human nervous system, more so than opiate receptors, acetylcholine receptors, nicotinic receptors, vanilloid receptors. There are more cannabinoid receptors in the human nervous system than any other receptor system, further underlying its biologic importance. One of my favorites, and I think probably would imagine would be highly useful for the chiropractic profession. Before I did naturopathic medical school, I, for many years, and I still am a licensed massage therapist, worked in a number of chiropractic offices. And a lot of the times we would do medical massage prior to adjustment. And the doctors would always say, oh, Jake, you do such a good job. Our patients are so easy to adjust after you've worked on them. And I also feel that topical cannabis products might be good adjuncts for the chiropractic profession, any body work profession for that matter, not only to apply to the patients prior to treatment, but also patients can also take these home with them and use them for pain relieving purposes. Endocannabinoid functioning at the peripheral end of pain receptors is the first line of defense against pain signaling. And cannabinoid signaling decreases release of various activators and sensitizers, the cytokine inflammatory cascades in and around the site of tissue injury. They open up potassium channels in the nociceptive or the pain signaling cell membranes. And they can hyperpolarize the nerve, making it less likely to fire. It's usually quite a mild effect. I find time after time again, it takes pain down about a 2 out of 10 on the pain scale. And this effect is produced by interactions with what we'll learn about later as CB1 cannabinoid receptors located in the peripheral endings of sensory neurons and are very much involved in pain transmission. Endocannabinoids and cannabinoid receptors in tissues will shift during many pathologic states. So part of what's happening with cannabinoid receptors that is slightly different than other receptor systems is that their levels are constantly fluctuating, because part of what they're doing is dealing with homeostasis and affecting and dealing with fluid changes that life brings along with it. This underlies the health balancing role, and there is and can be an instantaneous production of endocannabinoids. We talked about cannabinoids from plants, but just as there are opiates from plants and there are endorphins, which are naturally occurring opiate-like molecules that our body produces, our body also makes endocannabinoid molecules, and they are extremely important in physiology, and we are learning more about their role in pathology as well in terms of their impact and influence on injury and disease. We know clinically a lot about CBD now. It does provide clinical improvement in animal models of rheumatoid arthritis. Part of the way it's working is altering cell signaling, and this can help prevent the destruction of cartilage and collagen breakdown in joints. So there's a very important aspect of cell signaling and communication happening. Elevated levels of CB1 receptor, like the opioid receptor, are found in areas of the brain that modulate pain processing. So as pain initiates in the brain, there is an upregulation of CB1 receptors. These receptor populations can really vary to a large degree. So think about, how would that affect dosing? Are we giving a steady dose despite a variable receptor system, or is it a much more tailored and individualistic approach? And also, very importantly, cannabinoids of all types possess anti-inflammatory properties. So what are some of the basics of the endocannabinoid system? They are the body's own signaling molecules that work and run the endocannabinoid system. They are fatty acid neurotransmitters, not proteins or other molecules, and they safeguard body systems by coordinating and fine-tuning intracellular biochemistry and intercellular communication across all physiologic spectrums without exception. And as a result of the wide-ranging properties of the endocannabinoid system, there's a potential for it to be have an effect on many pathologic conditions, because those may involve alterations or disruptions in endocannabinoid synthesis, which is the making of our endocannabinoid molecules, or how those molecules are broken down, and also receptor expression. So there are a number of ways that the endocannabinoid system can be altered in pathology, and this is happening across all body systems. Cannabinoids provide relief in rats with osteoarthritis by triggering release of endocannabinoids. So the cannabinoids from the plant are not only just working in conjunction with the receptors, but they can also stimulate the body's own production of our own endocannabinoid molecules. And they also relieve muscle spasms, including those associated with multiple sclerosis, and can mitigate pain and fibromyalgia in human studies. I really like this slide. This is from 2014, but the results, and I did a YouTube video if anyone wants a deeper dive on cannabis and opiates. But you'll see with the upswing of the graph, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you can see this upswing of the graph, that's the rise of opiate deaths in Colorado over time. And right at this inflection point is where the legalization of cannabis occurred. And we see in state after state, jurisdiction after jurisdiction, a decrease in opiate-related deaths, opiate-related hospitalizations, opiate-related consumption, all across the board with legalization of cannabis. I think that this is a public health phenomenon, not related to biochemistry, but related to something else. So some of these products, including CBD products, may be enhancing consumer health. In this particular study, investigators used an interrupted time series designed to compare changes. And the authors said, quote, legalization of cannabis in Colorado was associated with short-term reductions in opiate-related deaths. As additional data become available, research should replicate these analyses in other states with legal recreational cannabis, and this has happened time and time again. If you are interested, please check out, I have an hour-long YouTube video on this that you might find super interesting. This is one of my favorite studies. As naturopaths, we use a lot of botanicals. We do manipulation, by the way. We're not as skilled as or spend as much time as chiropractic, but I do a lot of osteopathic, real gentle manipulations, including visceral work. But when we work with botanicals, which we do a lot, listening to patient feedback is critical. And what I really like about this study, it's titled Restored Self, a phenomenologic study of pain relief by cannabis. And what is occurring is that the patients are saying something like, I feel like myself again. So a lot of the times, or I've got my mojo back, or I feel like I've got my shine, that type of a thing. And what we typically think, a lot of us will think of cannabis and cannabinoids as being altering us away from self. But as you all likely know, patients in chronic pain have drifted away from who they are. They can be extra grumpy or irritable, or just not enjoying activities like they used to. And a lot of the times we know in all types of botanical medicine, we're getting a good dosing effect when they say, I feel like I'm back to my old self. part of the way botanicals work is subtly different than typical pharmacology, because pharmacology will very often be using one single molecule that is affecting a single biochemical pathway or target. Um, there is a new trend in pharmacology called network biology or network pharmacology. You can see here, perhaps if you can see my cursor. And if you look at this chart to the left, this multicolored circle, the blue piece, which you may or may not be able to see, are all of the different biochemical pathways that CBD affects. And those other areas are other cannabinoids such as THC, which we'll talk a little bit about, and others that you may not have heard of, CBN, CBG, etc. And what is happening with cannabis and cannabinoids, especially whole plant, is that there is a communication of biologic information across multiple receptor systems at the same time. This mimics what is going on in network biology, which is the study of interactions of biomolecules and pathways in combination that affect the organism. We're seeing this in advanced cancer therapies, where oncologists are hitting 4 or 5 or 6 different biochemical pathways at the same time. And why is this good? It's good because a lot of the chemotherapy drugs are very toxic. And when you use different molecules hitting different pathways at the same time, it allows for a reduction in dose, which means a reduction in toxicity or negative side effects, as well as an increase or enhancement of the biologic activity that we're trying to get at. And then in a way, this is how the plants are working. We're going to talk about this in a little more detail. So instead of thinking of single biochemical pathways, thinking of them as biologic networks, and the ability of the network to withstand disturbances both from the outside and from pathology on the inside is one way that the organism can be robust. And if a disease process alters this complex balance of the network of the physiology, the recovery of the equilibrium is a very promising venue for therapy and also for clinical research. CBD, as was demonstrated in the chart, has a number of molecular pathways that it hits. It affects the body's own endocannabinoid system. So in addition to its receptor effects, it helps to upregulate endocannabinoids. It also can reduce anxiety and pain through its actions on serotonin receptors. It can be involved in anti-inflammatory effects through transient receptor potential vanilloid receptors, TRPV receptors. There are anti-anxiety components that it has in addition to serotonin that occur through adenosine receptors, which is the receptor that caffeine largely affects, and can enhance bone density through its effects on GPR55, and also provides neuroprotection and antioxidant and glutamate toxicity protection through something called retrograde signaling, which we'll also talk a little bit about. So in a way, this network homeostatic system is a lot like the internet of the body. And here we are talking across hundreds and hundreds of miles. I'm in Washington State, and you guys are way on the other side of the country. If we have a bad connection, the information doesn't get across as well. But if we have a good connection, there's good flow of information. When there is static or disruption of the endocannabinoid system, body-wide communication becomes inhibited. And so just a reminder that the CBD and the cannabinoids aren't just working on one pathway. So people will often say, well, how come it acts like a magic bullet? It just seems so fanciful that one molecule could do so many things. And that's because it's not a magic bullet. It's more like a synergistic shotgun that is sending multiple, is hitting multiple targets at the same time. We do have a beginning of a body of literature that is providing significant evidence for potential health benefits of cannabinoids. And there are a number of disease processes where there is varying degrees of evidence for efficacy, at least on the symptom side of things. And then in conditions like multiple sclerosis, an autoimmune disease of the myelinated nerves of the nervous system, we actually have some indication that the cannabinoids, in addition to helping with symptoms, might actually be affecting the disease processes itself. And it's very exciting to see the new research coming across as we move through time. More and more studies are being released all the time. I think with you guys as an audience, it's obvious that cells can use molecules to talk with each other. The endocannabinoid system uses these endocannabinoid molecules to communicate with the receptors. Also, features of this system affect the enzymes that will create the endocannabinoids, as well as the enzymes that degrade them. So the system can be affected by the addition of either cannabis-based molecules or the body's own endogenous cannabinoids, the endocannabinoids, or things that will affect the receptor that are not cannabinoids. I mentioned echinacea previously, or also the enzymes that will synthesize or degrade endocannabinoids. For example, part of the way NSAIDs work is they will affect an enzyme called FAAH, fatty acid amide hydrolase, that is involved and can affect endocannabinoids. I mentioned that it's the most dense receptor in the human nervous system. It maintains the flow and balance of all organ systems. It regulates blood sugar. It regulates immune function, muscle and fat tissues, hormones, pain centers, reward centers, metabolic function. So think of metabolic diseases like diabetes. It is involved in maintaining the heart's rhythm, digestive processes in the intestines and stomach, the breathing rates at the lungs, the speed at which bone heals. It also enables us mentally to forget pain and biologically rewards us for eating and is affiliated with sexual drive and reproduction. As I mentioned, it functions as a self-regulating system. It's 600 million years old. What was life doing 600 million years ago? There were only single cells. Well, there were the beginnings of bodies, but the Earth was just coming out of a great ice age, and bodies had started to kind of form before that ice age, but the ice age ended, and about 600 million years ago, all of these single-celled organisms started evolving into the formation of bodies. So the system has been hardwired in from an evolutionary perspective, and that's why it is a preserved body-wide communication system. You may have heard of the saying, ontology recapitulates phylogeny. The evolutionary chain of development of various biologic systems almost mimics exactly the embryologic cascade. And I think a huge part of this system is interstitial or connective tissue. And I'm not sure how many first year versus fourth year students or undergrad students, so I'm not exactly sure at what level to talk about this. But the interstitial space inter means between, and stitial means cell. So the spaces between the cell, the water compartments between the cell, are the primary source of lymphatic fluid. And they're a major water compartment in the body, and it's where the inflammatory cascades occur. It's where neurotransmission occurs. The synapse is interstitial space, and it is the interface between the immune system and the nervous system. And previously, researchers thought that connective tissue was just simply an inert layer, kind of like a barrier or a wall, so to speak. But we now know that there are lymphatic microvessels in the cortex of the brain, for example, which have been identified using multiphoton microscopy. And unlike more solid organs like the liver or the heart or the kidneys, which we kind of can picture in our mind, the interstitium is a network of tissue that surrounds every organ and is interspersed between the tissues and is involved in nearly every cell in the body. And this is how it kind of acts like the internet of the body, is that it is like the ocean has seas and rivers and streams, and they're all connected. The interstitium is an entirely intact system, and I'll give you a visual on that in a second. We define an organ as something that is both self-contained and self-sufficient, and there is a wide body of literature that is now discussing interstitium as a potentially new organ system. I think that's all I have to say on that. So think of this from an evolutionary perspective, and we will see why it is wired into all of the systems. If we have a primitive single-celled organism, the seawater is where it gets its food. And if it has waste products, it ejects them right into the seawater. It's the primary exchange system. But in multicellular organisms, we need to get our nutrition and eliminate our waste from the cells into and out of the extracellular space, the interstitial space. So it corresponds to seawater, and the ion composition of our plasma correlates to seawater. And it solves the same problem that the single-celled organisms have. For example, we need to get oxygen to our cells. That travels through our blood in the plasma, and that's where the oxygen exchange occurs. And plasma is liquid connective tissue. When we get a cut in our hand, the fibrin cascade happens and it becomes a solid, but it is a liquid with solid properties to become solid when needed. Also, reactive oxygen species with oxygen and electrons that zip around the body, ripping off and damaging cell membranes, are also a huge part of the problem that this system helped to resolve. So if we think, what are the advantages of having a body? A body can be much more resistant to changes outside of the body. For example, when it gets cold, the body can keep us warm. When it gets hot, it can keep us cold. So in warm-blooded animals, this temperature maintenance is a key feature of homeostasis. The environment outside of our cells, our individual cells, determines the response of our cells. And so as organisms, we are dealing with a constant state of change and interaction with the outside world. And if we think of cells, they existed first in the ocean all by themselves. The nutrients were exchanged, but in order to form bodies, cells needed to bring all of these inside of a body. And let's take a look at what that looks like. You see here the brick wall, and the mortar maintains the mortar has a continuity all throughout the different layers of the brick. This is very similar to how the connective tissue works. Here we have collagen, which is a type of connective tissue, and you can see that it kind of mimics the shape, but there is this constant continuity throughout the connective tissue. And so the connective tissue represents the seawater that is outside of the cells of our body, yet contained within the organ itself. So bodies had to solve 4 problems as they moved from single-celled organisms to multi-celled organisms. And all 4 of these problems are the solution to all 4 of these problems involves the endocannabinoid system. And once I get through this slide, you should hopefully be having an idea of how it has such a broad effect on so many different systems. Bodies need to, first problem, bodies need to distribute food and energy to various tissues so that cells far from the food source can receive the nutrition and the nutrients, and they can get rid of and eliminate the waste products. So that's when we get, if you're a weekend warrior like myself, and I'm a lot less active during the week, but I get out, I love to surf on the weekends, my muscles get sore. That's the lactic acid that builds up in the muscle cells, and the muscle cells eject that. The muscle cells eject that into the connective tissue space, and we get that muscle soreness. So again, food and energy needs to get from the digestive system to the cells that are far from the food source if we have a body. A body also has to develop through stages. We have the sperm and the egg meet, and then we have the beginning of embryogenesis, where the embryogenic cells start to duplicate. They form the basis of stem cells, which then become the organs. And these cells are directed to move and morph into the various tissues and organs as they grow. And the endocannabinoid system is involved in all of these processes without exception. Also, if we have a body and the body gets hurt, I get a cut on my hand, bodies need to cope with injury and disease. And the damaged cells that receive the damage need to be able to coordinate and signal to other parts of the body that they are in need of help. Hey guys, we're in need of help here. And then the body must be able to mount a response to not only to repair the damaged cells, but also help heal or replace them if that is also what is needed. And again, endocannabinoid system is involved in all of these aspects. And lastly, bodies need ways of monitoring changes from within, but they also need to interpret changes in the outside environment and respond accordingly, depending on what those changes represent. So the endocannabinoid system directs all of these processes and helps us maintain our balance of health, otherwise known as homeostasis. And I haven't seen many good illustrations of connective tissue showing this water compartment. This, I believe, is areolar loose connective tissue. You can see that there is a large amount of non-cellular components. Here you can see a little capillary bed with the beginning of the return into the venous system, but lots of space that the artist has not filled in, but is composed of water. These aren't great slides, and I think there's room for medical illustrators to do a better job of drawing this system. These are extracellular components. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but these are extracellular components of connective tissue that link up with the cell membrane, connect all the way through the cytoplasm and into the nucleus of the cell. So the water compartment is outside, but there are compression and tension structures holding things in place. And also these connective tissue elements or integrins inside of the cytoplasm are part of how part of how molecular machines will guide molecules or small pieces of food or genetic information to the Golgi apparatus or to the nucleus. So they're kind of like a transport structure within the cell, and these are usually not drawn in anatomic illustrations, although there is a full and complete continuity of the interstitial structure, not only between cells, but also intracellularly as well. The interstitium is the terrain in which all immune processes and tissue take place. I like this illustration better. But here again, we have the capillary bed, and you can see the blue represents the water space, and various extracellular components are involved. So remember the interstitium, this component in blue here is the space where all health, immune response and proper tissue maintenance processes take place. Classically, 20th century science has focused on what's going on inside of cells, but much of the biologic information of the endocannabinoid system is happening outside of cells, though still inside of our body, and then is communicated to the inside of our cells. Every function, every process in the living body involves this connective tissue matrix in one way or another. For example, as I said, the matrix nourishes all of the cells in our body, and all of the waste products pass through it. And the very existence of organ cells depends on the intact functioning of the connective tissue system that guarantees this suitable environment for each and every cell. So this interstitium or connective tissue is not an inert filler, but it's a body-wide communication and support system necessary to all functions, kind of like a fiber optic network or the internet of the body. And if we look at the embryologic aspect of it, if we start at the very beginning with the sperm and the egg meet, the acrosome reaction, if we block the endocannabinoid system as that sperm is approaching the egg, it may make contact with the egg, but if the endocannabinoid system is blocked, fertilization does not occur. Likewise, if after fertilization happens, that single cell then becomes a ball of cells, travels through the fallopian tubes to make contact with the mom in the uterus and establish blood supply with the mom, which is where the placenta comes from. If we block the endocannabinoid system, that ball of cells will never make contact with the mom. So think again of this theme of connection. Likewise, when the baby is born, we can take mouse pups, newborn mice. If we block their endocannabinoid system, they are not able to suckle and drink the milk of the mom. So again, it is involved in all aspects of the feeding mechanism and the reproductive process. I'm hoping you can see my cursor. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but once fertilization occurs, we have cell division to 2 cells into 4 cells. And this is the beginning of the interstitium here. You can see in the 4-cell stage, there's a little cross there. And those are the beginning. That is the interface where cells are communicating with each other. And evolutionarily, interstitium or connective tissue is the first of the 4 tissues that actually developed from a biologic perspective. I think I've covered everything I want to discuss on that. Human breast milk contains endocannabinoids. So the baby is getting biologic information in the form of endocannabinoids from the mom in the breast milk. And as I mentioned, newborn mice stop suckling and die when administered rimonabant, which is a drug that blocks the cannabis receptors. So we spent a lot of time on the system. Let's talk a little bit about cannabis. Cannabinoids made by both humans, endocannabinoids, and plants are coordinating this system. There are dozens and dozens of cannabinoids, but I think the most important ones to be aware of is CBD right here. CBD, you all likely are familiar with. It does not cause a head high, but does have some pain relieving properties, some anxiety reducing properties, and does or can be helpful to induce sleep, at least for some people. THC is the predominantly psychoactive molecule that causes a head high. It's the reason that people use cannabis either recreationally or religiously, but it also does have anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving properties. CBG is becoming popular of late because folks say that it tends to create a feel-good sensation without a head high. And these are all made by the plant. And let's go to the next slide. So what I like about this slide is it is showing how with endocannabinoids, not with the plant-based cannabinoids, that they affect biologic oscillators or pacemaker cells in every single biologic oscillator or pacemaker that has been looked at, including circadian rhythms, blood pressure variation known as Traub-Herring waves, peristalsis waves, EKG and EEG rhythms, anything that keeps the biologic system within a set point, the endocannabinoids are involved. Think of a thermostat where if the room gets too hot, the air conditioner kicks on, and if the room gets too cold, the heat will turn on. That's like a biologic oscillator. All biologic oscillators in the body are affected by endocannabinoids. And I'm sorry, that last slide was out of place, but we will get to hemp and cannabis in a bit. But what I love about these next few slides is they show the protective aspects or potential protective aspects of cannabinoids. During conditions of nerve injury or damage to the axons, the cannabinoid receptors are upregulated. So if there's a nerve damage, I hit my thumb with a hammer, I say some expletives, and all at the same time that I'm swearing and saying words I can't say on camera here, the cannabinoid receptors are being upregulated. In glial cells, which are in the central nervous system and in other areas, anytime there is injury, they will upregulate cannabinoid receptors as well, including as much as 100 times. So the receptor populations can vary 100-fold within the nervous system. Again, to ask a question, if the receptors are varying 100-fold, what does that do with dosing? Here's a couple studies, modulation of CB2 in neurologic cells in response to, I'm sorry, I can't read this. But again, just further emphasizing the protective aspects of the endocannabinoids. I mentioned they're the most dense receptors in the entire nervous system, and anti-spasmodic and anti-inflammatory properties of CBD and THC are known to reduce and slow symptoms of MS. And these also are benefiting folks or can benefit folks with other complex autoimmune neurologic diseases like ALS or Huntington's disease. I really like this study. It's a heart study in mice. Cardiologists at Hebrew University, they blocked that anterior descending artery to the heart of the mice, and they gave them CBD. And the CBD reduced the size of the heart attack by 66%. So the cells, despite having a lack of oxygen in the treatment group with CBD, had far less cell death, dramatically less cell death than the animals that did not. This is a pretty cool study about influence on gut flora, the gut-brain connection. And this is with an MS model in mice. And are we good? Are we good? We good? Okay. The combinations of cannabinoids mitigates experimental autoimmune encephalomyelitis by altering the gut biome. So that is an MS model. And so the cannabinoids were given to the mice, and what the cannabinoids affected was not necessarily the neural tissue of the mice directly, but they affected the gut bacteria, which then created a beneficial factor. So there was a decrease in inflammatory cytokines. There were a higher increase in short chain fatty acids, which are healthy. Decreased populations of the bad bugs, especially the ones that make that degrade mucin, which erode the protective layer. Decreased LPS synthesis, lipopolysaccharide synthesis, which can be involved in pain, both locally and in the brain. All of this through a cascade that affects the gut flora. And our gut flora, the good bugs, use endocannabinoid signaling to talk to the human immune system, and it's a bi-directional communication. It's not just a one-way communication. Omega-3 fatty acid deficiency, so we're moving into more of a nutrition piece, is a strong predictor of autism with cannabis, and I'm going to have to put my glasses on here. What a drag it is getting old. Behavioral with cannabis, behavioral outbreaks were improved or very much improved in 60% of the autistic kids. The authors state that this preliminary study supports a feasibility that CBD-based cannabis trials in kids with autism might provide some benefits, and that the treatment might also have some involvement with other cannabinoids. Different study, medical cannabis, and an open study with a CBD to THC ratio of 20-1 or 6-1. So that's a lot of CBD and a little bit of THC. Helped kids with autism spectrum disorder. And this was done in Jerusalem and published in the Journal of Autism, which is a very prestigious journal. So we have a number of different cannabinoid receptors. Really, if you get from this talk, that the two main ones are CB1, which is happening in the brain, and CB2, which is happening in connective tissue. You've got most of it. It's not all of it. But just think about that the CB1 and the CB2 receptors are typically expressed in different areas of the body. It can get quite complex after that, but just the Cliff Notes version, CB1 receptors typically are involved in neural transmission, and CB2 receptors in inflammatory cascades of connective tissue. CB1 receptor will be distributed in different concentrations in different parts of the brain, so not all parts of the brain behave the same. So for a medical cannabis patient, for example, there might be downregulation of this cannabinoid receptors in the parts of the brain that give a head high, but the pain receptors seem to be more stable. So we find that a lot of the times with the medical cannabis patients, they are able to receive pain relief without as much of a head high, even when using CBD. Also, endocannabinoid system supports a healthy stress response. Baseline endocannabinoid tone can be affected by change. And again, it's the improper adaptation to health. Here we have on the roller coaster, several people in the exact same situation. Not everybody's afraid. Some people are having fun. So the physiology is going to depend on the perception. But this adaptability is an important skill, and there's some reasoning that endocannabinoid support can help with human adaptability. And the cannabinoids are intimately associated with hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. I think we're running out of time, so I want to talk about this pretty quickly because it's a cool feature of cannabinoids in pain. It's called retrograde inhibition. Usually I will ask the audience, think about a car and what makes a car work, and elicit questions, but our microphone's a little compromised, so that's okay. But think about what makes a car work, and people will usually say, oh, gasoline, or some people will say a motor, some people will say tires, some people will say the steering wheel, some people think extra hard and they think, oh, the cooling system makes the car work. But hardly anybody, when I ask this question, ever says brakes. Brakes are also essential for the car work, and we have this concept of things that work make things go. But part of what the endocannabinoid system does is it makes things slow down in the nervous system. This can be helpful for seizures, for example, where there is an electrical storm in the brain and the nerve cells are all screaming at each other. And this retrograde inhibition allows the nerve cells on the receiving end of all of this screaming to say, hey guys, time out, cool your jets, calm down. And we know that in seizure activity, this feature is very important to reduce glutamate toxicity, for example. Is also important in pain information or nociceptive pain signaling, especially with a topical. You can turn the volume of the pain down, and it slows the nerve transmission. And when this was discovered in through the endocannabinoid system, we did not know of, there were no other known receptor systems that were bidirectional this way. So, and then just the last few slides here, there's something that we think might be an alteration in the endocannabinoid system that could underlie the pathophysiology of these diseases that are complex: migraine headache, fibromyalgia, IBS, and these functional conditions. I really wanted to talk about Botanical Synergy. How are we on the time? Ben, is that Ben there behind? I've got 11 more slides. I'd like to talk about these then, and then we'll do a little Q&A. I'm sorry?
I said go for it. That's all.
Oh, good. Thank you. Cannabis studies show that the whole plants are demonstrating 2 to 4 times greater effect than the single molecule alone, so that the CBD delivered as a whole plant as opposed to an isolate, think of caffeine in an energy drink versus caffeine in tea. The caffeine in the tea is in the whole plant, and the energy drink, it is an isolate. A lot of the times the physiologic responses are different. The whole plant seems to be having better responses. And that's because plants extracts are typically hitting multiple targets. When we have a single target, we can only get additive effect. But when we have multiple chemicals hitting multiple targets, that is where we get the beginning of synergistic effects, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For example, we know if we use a whole plant cannabis versus just a synthetic CBD, the dose response curve is different, and you get a much better dose response curve with the whole plant than with the synthetic. There are other very important molecules in cannabis that are known as terpenes that have physiologic effects. One of my absolute favorites is beta-caryophyllene. I use it as a THC substitute. If somebody I don't think is going to do well with THC, I like plants with high beta-caryophyllene and low THC. Myrcene is typically known to be responsible for couch lock. Linalool, which is found in lavender as well. It can be very relaxing. Pinene for recreational effects, if we're talking recreation, tends to be more wake-inducing, as is limonene, which has come from lemon. And the terpenes, feel free to ask me in the Q&A. The terpenes are produced by many plants, not just cannabis. And again, the terpenes and the cannabinoids can work together to where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Essential fatty acids are essential for the working of this system because it's a lipid-based system. And the ideal ratio of essential fatty acids, omega-6 to omega-3s, is 3-to-1, 4-to-1, which is actually beautiful in hemp seeds. Hemp seeds do not get you high, and they're good food. Chia flax will also have high levels of omega-3s, but not in a proper ratio. So the cannabis plant is doing some amazing things this way. When we give cannabinoids with healthy fats, we get a better response. That's what this study is, that the healthy fats can help help the body deliver cannabinoids to lymphatic and immune system in a better way. And there's 2 studies here by Greco and McPartland. Feel free to text or I guess email me if you guys want these, because this is where I think a large part of holistic health treatments also affect this. Acupuncture, very importantly, spinal manipulation, massage, exercise, good healthy Mediterranean diet affects this system. And here is a sample of good healthy lipids showing positive responses in the endocannabinoid system. So don't just think of this system as being cannabis-based, although the cannabinoids can help. It can also be largely influenced by, massively influenced by manipulative therapy, other types of touch therapy, and other botanicals as well. So just remember that we are working with networks when we're dealing with plants, not biochemical pathways. And to save a little bit of time, I'll leave this slide up for a little bit. And just want to thank you for being patient. I've been about 62 minutes, so I'm a little bit over time, but I appreciate you listening, and now I'd be super happy to take any questions that you might have.
Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask directly?
I do.
Yes, go ahead.
So like, I guess my question is how available are cannabinoids when they're put on topically or eaten or even smoked?
Okay, good, great.
Oh, you can hear them? Okay.
I can hear. Do you want me to repeat for the rest of the folks in the room? I can't.
No, we're
Y'all
good.
heard?
I'm not sure if you can hear them.
Great question. They don't all cross the skin barrier equally. Probably the best one that crosses the skin barrier is CBD. It crosses about 10 times more readily than THC does. We know from animal studies that the cannabinoids are getting through the skin barrier and into underlying muscle tissue, at least some of them. And also remember that some, if it's a whole plant derived, they'll also come with terpenes, and terpenes can also enhance penetration. And again, one of my favorite terpenes for pain relief, including for nerve pain, is beta-caryophyllene. And also you can enhance absorption through the skin through carriers such as an ethanol, which is not usually what's recommended, or other highly absorptive oils such as a castor oil or a copaiba oil. And there are companies now that are making transdermal products with nanotechnology. I've read some of the studies. Some of them I'm like, not so good. And I have seen a couple of good studies showing nano emulsification techniques enhancing. But yes, I do think that there needs to be a degree of penetration. And there aren't many human studies, but the animal studies are showing that it is a concentration dependent. So the client or patient needs to use more. And then I would also like to just say, as a body worker myself, one of the benefits of utilizing cannabis topicals for the practitioner is not that there's a pretty quick muscle relaxation and mild to moderate pain relief, but it's also really good for overuse stuff for the hands of the practitioner. So I think that there's some cross benefit that way. You mentioned absorption in other ways. I think I should probably talk about this because it's important. When we take cannabinoids through the digestive tract, a lot of people think, oh, I'm gonna just have an edible, and that's better than inhalation, which I can see that that's not bad thinking at all. But the body processes an oral differently than an inhaled product. When we take cannabis or a cannabinoid orally, it goes into the stomach. The small is absorbed and taken to the liver for first pass metabolism. And if it's THC specifically, the first pass metabolism in the liver puts an alcohol on the 11th carbon. It becomes an 11 hydroxy THC. That alcohol holds it in the plasma, which remember is connective tissue longer. And so when we take an edible, we have a much longer duration of an effect, which is not always good, because you can also have it's delayed and it can be very accentuated. So one of the major problems with THC on the medical side orally, especially with newbies, is it's real easy to take too much. And then if you do take too much, it lasts too long. Inhalation has a benefit of very quick absorption. You get the effects right away. So if the patient is having severe migraines and they get an aura, they can utilize a vaporizer and get quick onboard relief. But the downside of an inhalation is, like if you're using it for pain, for example, is it doesn't last very long. So if I have knee pain and I do an inhalation, I might get to bed at 10 p.m., but I might be up again at 2 a.m. with pain versus with an edible, which has a longer duration of activity. So.
Great explanation. Ethan?
Yeah, I have a question. So I actually have epilepsy, and a common question that I've had is, like, what's the best method of delivery, whether it's CBD, or any of the, ECS, basically.
Epilepsy is tough to treat. I'm sure you've been recommended dietary features. And again, those dietary features also involve lipid metabolism. So if you're doing some type of ketogenic diet, I would highly emphasize oils that have potential benefits for endocannabinoid signaling, olive oil being one of them, also good omega-3s. But on the cannabinoid side, with epilepsy, the doses are typically way, way higher than with other uses, such as for pain or for sleep. And typically starting at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, but they can go way up to the sky being the limit. That may have other features that you may or may not tolerate well. Once you start getting into really high doses, you can get a little loose stool, or you can get daytime sleepiness. So epilepsy is a challenge. I always refer to an epilepsy specialist who specializes in cannabis to help with that ramp up. But just to address,
Do you know anybody that specializes in cannabis with epilepsy?
Absolutely. I refer people in Washington to Sunil Agarwal, Aggarwal. You guys are in Georgia, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anyone in Georgia, but shoot me an email or find me on LinkedIn, and I know there will be some telemed practitioners we can connect you with.
Awesome, thank you.
You're very welcome.
I'll get you his email before. Okay. And then Patrick or Mike? Patrick, whoever.
So with your patients, do you recommend THC, or how do you
Personally, I don't. Personally, I don't, unless they're having trouble. And that's personal reasons. I do, if I think they might do well with THC, I will first try beta caryophyllene, and you can use beta caryophyllene in conjunction with the CBD product. But for example, certain conditions do seem to do better with THC. For example, PTSD. Part of the problem with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is there is a dysregulation of the event where the horrific thing happens, whether it's an automobile accident or a sexual assault or an act of war. The nervous system gets easily, the memories are entrenched and they can't let go of the memories. And so part of what will happen is they will have nightmares, night terrors. And part of what the THC does really well is it reduces night terrors, frequently on night one, if you get the dose right. I don't think of THC as very good long-term, but it can get people through some tough spots. That's my personal opinion. I know other people feel differently. But I think, for example, for PTSD, that can be very helpful, especially early on in helping people get to sleep. And I'm not sure if the dreams are not occurring or if they're just not remembered, but folks will frequently be able to get a full and complete night's rest. Other areas where THC might be helpful, sometimes with nerve pain, and the CBD isn't touching it, the THC can be helpful. Or if a patient has tried NSAIDs, opiates, they're doing everything right, sometimes a little bit of THC can help. And I'm very conservative with my THC dosing. I will like to start people with 1 milligram. In Washington State, they consider 10 milligrams the bottom dose. No. But 1 milligram, 2.5 milligrams, 5 milligrams, 7.5, before we even get close to 10 milligrams. That can sometimes be hard to do because they come in different forms. But if, say, for example, you have a 10 milligram gummy, you can approximately cut it in half and you'll have 5 on either side of that. Is that helpful? Did I answer that question?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I was going to ask about how do you start with these different tolerance levels, because everyone's different.
Very, very, very low at first.
Yeah.
Now, you can ask the patient, do they have much experience with cannabis? And that can help you move things along. But if somebody has experience with inhalation, they may not with an edible. And even if they have a lot of experience with inhalation, I do find that it's very helpful to be cautious with the edible. Also, if you're worried about them not liking the head high, a lot of elderly patients do not want a head high. You can bump the CBD up, and CBD can affect how THC is interacting with that CB1 receptor, and it somewhat blunts the effect. Kind of like with the tea and caffeine. Caffeine can make people jittery, but that's usually in an energy drink or with a lot of coffee. Tea hardly ever makes people jittery because it contains a molecule called L-theanine, which helps to reduce that. So if you're worried about, if you want to get THC therapeutically, but you're worried about the head high, having a high CBD, low THC strain can be helpful. And also remembering your terpenes as well. If you want, if it's for daytime use, you want the myrcene to be low. If it's for, if they are wanting something for a daytime, they're going to go for a walk in the woods or something like that. Maybe a little extra limonene. If you have a product where you can look at the a lab that's done the full spectrum analysis on that.
Thank you.
You kind of answered part of this question, but how do you have any challenges with your patients with this therapy?
Oh yeah, all the time. Yes. Go
How
ahead.
do you destigmatization of
The second question is, I think, much more interesting. But the first one is much more practical. Um, I have a lot of trouble with THC. It's hard to get right. One of the reasons is a lot of people want to do oral because they don't want to do another method. There are serious disadvantages with inhalation, and by inhalation, I'm not meaning smoking, but vaping. They can still irritate the lungs. Some people don't like them. You can do an oral mucosal to get around that, but it's not always the same effect, and I don't really know why. Especially with cannabis naive patients, and by naive I don't mean naive in the negative sense, but just somebody who's never really used it very much. I have to be very cautious with the THC. And a lot of the times they'll leave the office and go get some advice from a well-meaning friend or a bud tender, and they just get too much, and they're never, ever, ever going to use it again if they have too much. So that's one of the main barriers. In terms of stigma for those patients, I like to start with a topical. Now, topicals are very subtle. I started realizing a lot of my patients were getting relief with topicals, but they didn't know it. How in the world can that be? So let me explain myself. A topical will typically only take the pain down about 2 out of 10. It's not a big shift. And remember, it's also dose dependent, so you need to use enough of it. But if the pain is decreasing, a lot of the times our nervous system does not register it, and we just end up feeling better. And you could go through your whole afternoon and thinking you just had a good afternoon, and back at dinner time, and because the topicals don't last very long, back at dinner time, and I still got my pain and it didn't work. So I have patients give their pain a pre-treatment number on a scale of 1 to 10, self-apply, and then 15, 20 minutes later, check in with their pain levels. That's a good way to do it. And that destigmatizes, because you don't get a head high with a topical. So I think across the board, topicals are destigmatizing. Even if they have THC in them, they will not cause a head high. But the broader second question about stigma, I think there is a lot of stigma. I don't think it's going anywhere soon, but I think as young folks come up, there's less stigma. So that piece will slowly go away over time. I do think that data and education is important. And I also think that as holistic practitioners, we have an open mind about things that conventional practitioners may not. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, even the word endocannabinoid system, even though it's a homeostatic system, just that it has the word cannabinoid in it, I think creates some barriers. So I think education is good. I think patients telling their stories is good. I think encouraging healthcare practitioners, try a topical, and don't worry if it's got CBD in it. You're not going to test positive. Even the human studies showing that even if a topical has THC in it, it does not cause a positive urinalysis. I'll say to the practitioners, don't even worry about it. Just get a CBD isolate or a hemp-based product, and you're not going to have to worry about the THC, and try it, and it can be effective. And for me personally, I really like cannabinoids in subacute phase, not acute. And I don't like to use them chronically over time. I like to use them for breakthrough in other areas, because personally I feel that we can use other holistic methods, including both high velocity and low velocity manipulations, dietary interventions, other botanicals. And I find, and I've been doing this for a long time, the cannabinoids are really good to just smooth out those humps of difficulty that people are getting through. That's my personal opinion. I don't think that that's a majority opinion of cannabinoid practitioners, so take that with a grain of salt. Thank you all. You can find me at Sweetwater Holistic, which is on the screen, but better yet, look me up on LinkedIn if you're there.